He sat in his cockpit, the warm Pacific wind humming across the canopy of his Mitsubishi A6M0, the sea below stretching in unbroken blue. Lieutenant Kenji Watanabe adjusted his goggles, peering into the haze ahead. The mission was routine: a patrol between the atolls, intercept any American reconnaissance, guard the flank of his squadron. Yet radio chatter crackled unexpectedly in his earphones. English voices, clipped, urgent, speaking of Hellcats launching from a tiny ship. He frowned. That made no sense. Only fleet carriers carried fighters. Escort carriers were for transport, for resupply, for screening, never for front-line fighter operations, not here this close to Japanese-held islands. He had flown enough escort missions to know how little respect the Imperial Navy deemed them worthy of. But the voices persisted. 2 bogies off the bow, launching from minimal deck, 5 Hellcats airborne. Watanabe's heart hammered. He banked left, lifting altitude to scan for silhouettes against the horizon. There, a small naval deck craft, compact and squat, deck edged with guardrails, catapult rails glinting. On deck, shapes moved, fighters, Hellcats, the unmistakable outlines of Grumman F-6F wings, folded and unfolding, engines roaring to life. His breath caught. Escort carrier launching fighters here? Impossible. Since late 1944, the US Navy had introduced a vast expansion of escort carriers, the so-called jeep carriers or baby flat-tops, built for speed and numbers, intended to provide local air cover to convoys, amphibious operations, and anti-submarine screening. The Casablanca class, among the most numerous, could carry 20 to 30 aircraft and boasted a flight deck less than half the length of a fleet carrier. Ships like USS Thetis Bay, CVE-90, and USS Savo Island, CVE-78, entered service precisely for this role. Yet in Japanese doctrine, these were auxiliary assets, not to be taken seriously in offensive aviation. The Imperial Navy's calculations always presumed US air superiority would come from the big flat-tops, Essex, Yorktown, and Midway-class carriers that could field full fighter wings, bombers, scouts. The escort carriers were logistical footnotes, not threat vectors. Watanabe's schooling echoed this strategic complacency. At pilot training and in wartime briefings, American naval aviation was always anchored by capital ships, their flight decks vast, their air groups mighty. Escort carriers might shuttle aircraft or guard convoys, but never would they launch fighter sweeps near the front lines, especially deep into Japanese territory. He held that assumption now, even as his eyes betrayed him. The shapes on the minimal deck turned into Hellcats, their Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engines screaming to full power. The F-6F Hellcat was no lightweight. It was a rugged, powerful fighter designed to counter the Zero with superior structural strength, heavier armament, and favorable performance in most conditions. In fact, more than 12,000 Hellcats would be built during the war. Watanabe's squadron had engaged Hellcats before, always from carriers or land bases. They respected them, though often derided them in propaganda as heavy, sluggish machines compared to our graceful Zero. Yet now the irony struck him. These very fighters were emerging from a ship that by all logic should not have flown anything other than utility aircraft. He keyed his radio. "This is Watanabe. Confirm location of that carrier." 5 fighters launching silence answered. Then static. Then faint Japanese chatter. 0112, maintain altitude. Verify visual contact. Prepare to engage. He flipped a switch to magnify his sight and saw Hellcats peeling off the deck, banked in formation, climbing toward his patrol altitude. The escort carrier behind them was small, perhaps 500 feet longer than his Zero's range for a quick interception run, yet alive with machinery. Blast doors rising, catapult gear sliding, flash from propellers. For decades, IJN carrier doctrine had rested on a hierarchy: fleet carriers, light carriers, then auxiliaries. Escort carriers occupied the bottom rung. Their air groups were minimal, used mostly defensively, rarely in offensive sweeps into contested airspace. Watanabe had drilled in that doctrine. Seas had been clear for it. Now the doctrine wavered. Flight logs from U.S. archives confirm that Hellcats did, in fact, operate from escort decks. The Hellcats' wing design and relatively forgiving landing characteristics made it viable for even modest decks, a fact that surprised many in naval aviation circles. The sudden appearance before his eyes proved that theory had become practice. He realized, even as he shifted his grip on throttle and joystick, that the assumptions of air superiority, that Japanese pilots would always know from where the next threat would come, were crumbling. At 15,000 feet, Watanabe's dome reflected dark shadows. 4 Hellcats in V formation, closing fast. Their metallic surfaces gleamed, engines spitting vapors in the moist Pacific air. Against the blue-green backdrop, they moved with precision. He counted their wingtip tanks. He heard their radio chatter, crisp, disciplined. His comrades murmured on his wing mic, "What is that deck? From which ship do they fly?" They were unsteady. Always they had looked outward, toward fleet carriers, toward known vectors. Never inward, never toward the small shadow off the stern, never toward the sea lanes where logistics now carried wings. In Japanese war diaries, post-war debriefings from the 4th Air Group and other units, one recurring entry echoed a phrase: "Enemy fighters from no known base, from ships too small to host fighters." Those journal fragments were often dismissed by command, until too many pilots reported the same. Now Watanabe faced one of those moments himself. The Hellcats closed in 3/4 attack arcs. He banked sharply, descending into a dogfight envelope. His Zero's agility at low speeds was still superior, but here, altitude and power favoured the Hellcats. He would need surprise, manoeuvring, and nerves. In that moment, the opening scene of a new era flashed before him. Hellcats emerging from escort decks in regions Japanese pilots considered safe, challenging doctrine, forcing a rethinking of naval air strategy. He never expected to see such a thing, and as his Zero dove toward the first Hellcat, he realized he had already lost more than surprise. He had lost the illusion of where power flew from. His radio crackled again in American English. "Enemy fighters inbound, vectors from escort deck. Confirm, 5 bogies, vector 320. The voices were calm, confident. The shock was his alone. His squadron turned, engines screaming, and the small escort carrier below turned east, steam wreathing from its stacks, launching more Hellcats from a deck too small to be believed. That was the mirage. The day the South Seas whispered that even small ships could carry thunder. The first time Commander Joseph McConnell watched a Hellcat thunder down the deck of USS White Plains CVE-66, he felt equal parts pride and disbelief. The Casablanca-class escort carrier had a deck just 512 feet long, barely the length of a New York City block. The Hellcat, Grumman's big-boned fighter, needed every inch of it. As the fighter roared past the island superstructure and leapt into the humid air, the deck crew dropped to their knees, ducking beneath the blast of prop wash. Then the pilot's voice came over the TBS circuit, steady, confident. "Hellcat Blue 1, airborne and climbing." In that clipped announcement was the culmination of a quiet revolution in American naval warfare, one that had begun not with admirals, but with engineers and bureaucrats. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy possessed just 6 fleet carriers. After December 7th, the need for more flight decks became desperate. Shipyards could not turn out Essex-class vessels fast enough, so the Navy's Bureau of Ships proposed something audacious: convert commercial hulls, merchantmen, oilers, even passenger liners, into miniature aircraft carriers. They called them escort carriers, or CVEs, carrier, escort. They would be slow, maybe 18 knots on a good day, and lightly armoured. But they could carry 24 planes, enough to patrol convoys, fend off submarines, and provide air cover for invasions. The skeptics were legion. Admiral Ernest King dismissed them as cheap, clumsy compromises. Even some aviators argued no serious fighter could safely operate from such cramped decks. Early trials with Wildcats and Avengers were hair-raising, planes skidding into barriers, propellers chewing through safety nets. But by late 1942, the Casablanca class proved that ingenuity could overcome size. Built by Kaiser shipyards at breakneck speed, one every 50 days at peak output, these baby flat-tops could launch aircraft via simple catapults and recover them with hydraulic arrestor cables. Each carried about 28 planes, 12 fighters and 16 torpedo bombers, enough to project force far beyond any convoy's radius. By 1943, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat had become the workhorse of the US Navy. Unlike its predecessor, the F-4F Wildcat, the Hellcat was designed specifically to counter the Zero. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine produced 2,000 horsepower. Its 6.50 caliber Browning guns gave it crushing firepower. In testing, it could climb to 20,000 feet in under 7 minutes and outdive anything Japan fielded. The Navy loved its sturdiness. A Hellcat could take bullet holes in wings and still limp home, while a Zero's light frame often burned from a single tracer hit. The question was, could it fly from an Escort carrier? Lockheed and Grumman engineers ran simulations and deck trials at Quonset Point. The Hellcat's short takeoff run, coupled with a strong tailhook and forgiving stall characteristics, meant it could just manage a launch from a Casablanca-class deck, especially with a headwind and catapult assist. By spring 1944, trials aboard USS Sangamon and USS White Plains confirmed it. The baby flat-tops could carry Hellcats, and that changed everything. The 1944 invasion of the Marianas, Operation Forager, marked the first mass deployment of Hellcats aboard escort carriers. The 50th Task Group, known as Taffy 1, fielded a motley collection of CVES, destroyer escorts, and oilers. Their job? Provide close air support and anti-submarine patrols for invasion convoys. In the words of Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's after-action report, Naval History and Heritage Command, H. Graham 018, our jeep carriers proved indispensable. The Hellcats flew day and night over the beaches, destroying any attempt by the enemy to contest the landings. The enemy expected our air power only from fleet carriers. He never conceived we'd put fighters on escort decks. To the Japanese, those small ships seemed logistical vessels. Their silhouettes lacked the commanding island structure of a shokaku or enterprise. Recon pilots dismissed them as supply carriers. That assumption would cost lives. On the other side of the Pacific, Lieutenant Kenji Watanabe of the 201st Air Group scribbled into his logbook that night, "Sighted small carrier, unfamiliar silhouette. Launched Grumman fighters. Deck length impossible, yet aircraft rose steadily." Our command believes misidentification. His commanders in Truk rejected the report. A tiny vessel launching Hellcats seemed absurd, but more sightings followed in June and July 1944. Messages from Formosa, the Philippines, and the Bonin Islands describing miniature carriers, sending out interceptors. Captured Japanese war diaries, U.S. National Archives, Record Group 38, reveal the mounting confusion. Enemy has created illusion of endless carriers. When one is sunk, another appears. Fighters rise from transports, tankers, impossible. The illusion wasn't magic. It was industrial scale. By late 1944, America had built 50 Casablanca-class escort carriers, plus 37 Bogue and Sangamon-class ships. The US could now flood entire sea lanes with flight decks. To pilots like Watanabe, that felt like fighting a mirage, a phantom fleet that never ended. Before the war, Japanese carrier doctrine revolved around the Kantai-Kessen, the decisive fleet engagement. Large carriers were to duel other large carriers. Air power, in that view, was an extension of capital ship warfare. The Americans turned that logic on its head. By decentralizing air power, spreading squadrons across dozens of escort carriers, they ensured no single defeat could cripple their reach. Each baby flat top became a node in a vast network, supporting amphibious landings, hunting submarines, and providing combat air patrols over invasion beaches. Even Admiral Nimitz admitted surprise at their effectiveness. In a 1944 memorandum, U.S. Pacific Fleet Archives, "Our escort carriers, once considered defensive, have proven offensively capable. The Hellcat gives them teeth, their numbers give them omnipresence." The climax came at Leyte Gulf, October 1944. When the Japanese center force broke through San Bernardino Strait, it encountered Taffy 3, a formation of 6 escort carriers, among them USS White Plains, Fanshawe Bay and Kalinin Bay. Their only air power, 24 Hellcats and 12 Avengers per ship. Facing them, 4 Japanese battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Sprague's log captured the impossible. "Our Hellcats made repeated strafing and bombing runs against cruisers at point-blank range. The enemy believed they faced fleet carriers. Their reports speak of heavy air groups. In truth, we had none to spare." Japanese survivors later testified that the unexpected fighter assaults from the small carriers sowed panic. They overestimated the size of the American force, believing they faced Essex-class carriers. That illusion, born from those tiny ships, helped save the American invasion force. As Watanabe circled his crippled Zero above the endless blue, he watched the tiny ship retreat beneath a halo of rising smoke. More Hellcats clawed into the sky, their silhouettes bright against the dawn. For the first time he understood. America had turned its industrial genius into an ocean of flight decks. The age of the few, mighty carriers was over. The age of many small ones had begun. He pressed the throttle, the Zero trembling. Somewhere below, a squadron of Hellcats rolled into formation, climbing after him, the growl of their engines reverberating through the humid air. They came from the unthinkable, from decks too short, ships too small, and a nation too inventive to fight by anyone else's rules. And in the South Seas that morning, the legend of the jeep carriers became real, one Hellcat at a time. South Pacific, early 1945. The sun rose over Leyte Gulf like a molten coin. On the flight deck of USS Kitkun Bay, CVE-71, the air was already alive. Deck crews in yellow shirts signalling, ordnance handlers loading 50-caliber belts, and the salty smell of aviation fuel mixing with sweat and exhaust. Beneath that noise, a quiet truth pulsed through the convoy. These baby flat tops, once mocked as slow, soft, and disposable, had become the sharp edge of a new kind of air war. At 05:30 hours, Lieutenant, junior grade, George Tex Franklin kicked the throttle of his F-6F Hellcat forward. The Casablanca-class carrier pitched slightly in the swells, but the catapult officer waved him on. "Hellcat Blue 2, cleared for launch." The deck blurred beneath him, the catapult fired, and Franklin was airborne, climbing into the haze that hung over Samar. Below, the Kitkun Bay looked impossibly small, a postage stamp surrounded by grey sea. In his gun sight, the horizon shimmered with rising heat. His orders were simple: fly a 75-mile patrol radius, report any enemy surface or air contacts, and cover the landing ships now crawling toward Luzon. It was, in essence, the work of the escort carriers. Not glory, not fleet duels, but coverage. Unending, methodical, crucial. The Japanese would soon learn to fear that kind of persistence. From the outside, escort carriers looked unimpressive. They were 10,000-ton ships with open decks, weak armour, and a top speed barely above a destroyer's. Yet the 13th Fighter Command debriefing reports from April 1945, Air Force Historical Research Agency, described them as the backbone of air endurance, the ships that made every invasion sustainable. Each CVE carried 12 to 18 Hellcats and a handful of Avengers, enough to provide continuous combat air patrol (CAP) coverage. Rotations were relentless. Pilots flew 4-hour sorties, landed, refueled, and were airborne again within the hour. To a Japanese observer, particularly those of the 4th Air Group operating from the Philippines and Formosa, these small carriers were ghosts. They appeared where logic said they shouldn't, their aircraft intercepting raids hundreds of miles from known fleet carriers. A captured Japanese signal, ATIS translation number 1437, August 1945, summarized the confusion. Enemy fighters now appear from unidentified ships within convoys. These cannot be fleet carriers. They rise from small vessels, perhaps armed transports. We cannot understand their number. The Japanese airmen's disbelief was understandable. In their doctrine, small ships were auxiliaries, not strike platforms. No other navy had tried to launch frontline fighters from such minimal decks. But the Americans didn't care about perfection. They cared about quantity. The Hellcat thrived in this chaos. Its design lent itself to short-deck operations, strong undercarriage, high-lift wing, wide landing gear. It was forgiving, even for tired pilots coming home on fumes. Franklin's squadron, VF-93, flew a mix of early F6F-3S and the newer F6F-5S, which featured improved armour and a strengthened canopy. They called their planes Grumman Ironworks, a nickname born from durability. One pilot, Lieutenant Ralph Shepard, once limped home to Fanshawe Bay with half a rudder and 3 cylinders dead. The plane still landed. "She just didn't know how to die," he said in his debrief, National World War II Museum Oral History Collection. For Japanese airmen used to the Zero's featherweight agility, the Hellcat seemed monstrous, and its pilots unshakable. "We hit them and they did not fall," recalled Petty Officer Masao Kaneko of the 601st Air Group in a 1946 interrogation transcript. "It was like shooting at armoured tanks in the sky." When those armoured tanks began pouring from escort decks, morale in the Japanese air service cracked. They could no longer gauge the strength of the enemy. Every convoy was a potential ambush. In January 1945, Japan threw one last desperate air counterattack at the American landings on Luzon. Over 100 kamikazes from Formosa and Luzon converged on the Allied convoys. What they didn't expect was Hellcat cap from escort carriers like Kitkan Bay, Natoma Bay, and Omagh Bay. At 0910 hours on January 5th, radar aboard Kitkan Bay picked up bogies approaching from 60 miles northwest. The fighters scrambled, 4 Hellcats clawing for altitude. Within minutes, they intercepted a mixed wave of Zeros and twin-engine Betty bombers diving toward the transports. Combat reports, 13th Fighter Command debriefing, January. 1945 tell the rest. 4 Hellcats engaged approximately 20 enemy aircraft, 9 confirmed kills, 3 probables. Remaining attackers dispersed. No hits on convoy. The Japanese after-action note found in the captured 4th Air Group diary simply read, "Attack failed. Enemy fighters from small ships appeared without warning. We were deceived by their number and origin." That phrase, "fighters from small ships," would recur again and again in Japanese reports through 1945. It symbolized a shift deeper than tactics. It represented the collapse of the Imperial Navy's worldview. While the enemy tried to understand how these ships could exist, life aboard them was brutally simple. Pilots ate powdered eggs, slept in bunks stacked 4 high, and landed on decks so short that one mistake meant swimming home. Yet morale was oddly high. The small crew meant tight bonds. Mechanics and pilots knew each other by name. When a Hellcat came back riddled with bullet holes, Deck crews painted small messages on the fuselage. "Still kickin'," she bites back. "Try harder next time, Tojo." For the Japanese pilots reading intercepted reports of these floating nests, it added insult to injury. They had been trained in the code of the warrior: precision, honor, perfection. The Americans seemed to win through messiness and mass. As one Japanese post-war memoir, 1962 U.S.-Japanese Aviation Symposium Proceedings, observed, "We faced an enemy who turned mediocrity into strength. Their ships were crude, their pilots ordinary, but they were everywhere." By the spring of 1945, the Pacific skies had changed character. The grand carrier battles, Coral Sea, Midway, Philippine Sea, were over. What replaced them was a constant hum of small engagements, patrols and interceptions waged by CVE-based Hellcats. Japanese search planes rarely returned. "You could tell when you were near the Americans," Kaneko said. "The air felt heavy with their presence." From Okinawa to the Philippines, the illusion deepened. Japanese spotters counted dozens of fleet carriers in a single task group. In reality, many were escort carriers, each modest in strength but multiplied into overwhelming effect. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey later summarized it best. The proliferation of escort carriers destroyed Japanese air confidence. They no longer believed there was a safe approach vector. Air power had ceased to be localized. It was omnipresent. By late April 1945, Japanese command acknowledged the crisis. Intercepted communications, Allied Translator Section, April 27, 1945, revealed an urgent order. "Assume all convoys are protected by air units from small carriers. Adjust attack plans accordingly." But by then it was too late. Pilot training quality had collapsed. Fuel was scarce, and everywhere they turned, even against transports or oilers, Hellcats rose to meet them. From his cockpit, Lieutenant Franklin could see it too. Each patrol he flew stretched the invisible frontier of American power further across the Pacific. The jeep carriers had erased distance itself. On the night of May 3rd, Franklin landed in darkness, his fuel gauge empty, his Hellcat's skin scarred by flak. The deck crew clapped him on the shoulder as he climbed down. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese pilots like Kaneko stared into the blackness, wondering how such small ships could carry so much death. The next morning, the horizon burned again, not from fleet carriers, but from the fury of the escorts. The war in the Pacific had entered its strangest phase, one fought not by giants, but by swarms of small ships with giant claws. And above those humble decks, the Hellcat reigned supreme, the machine that turned tiny ships into floating thunderclouds. The Japanese called them Yojaku Butai, weak squadrons. But by 1945, every Zero pilot knew the truth. When the weak squadrons appeared, the sky itself belonged to them. Philippine Sea, February 1945. The storm that swept across the convoy on February 20th was the kind that seemed to tear the sky in half. Rain slammed against the deck of USS White Plains in sheets so dense they erased the horizon. Waves pitched over the bow, cascading through the scuppers as if the ocean were trying to reclaim the ship. In the ready room below deck, Lieutenant Commander Robert Dutch Ellison traced a grease pencil line across a map of Luzon's western coast. "They'll come through here," he said, tapping a red circle near Lingayen Gulf. "Even the weather won't stop them." The Japanese are desperate. His men sat around the table, rain hammering above like artillery. They were exhausted. Half their squadron had flown 3 sorties that day already, and the Hellcats were showing their age: patched bullet holes, engines that coughed black smoke, radios held together by tape. Yet none of it mattered. If Japanese bombers came for the convoy again, the Hellcats would rise, storm or not. The radar picked up the first contacts at 15-20 hours, faint echoes, low altitude, heading straight for the amphibious ships off Zambales. "Betties!" someone said. Or maybe Francis. Ellison nodded. Hellcats, on deck. It was madness to launch in that storm, but there was no choice. As the deck crew lashed themselves to the tie-down lines, 6 Hellcats clawed their way down the slick planking of the Casablanca-class deck, engines roaring against the wind. One pilot, Ensign Paul Geller, later described the moment in a letter home, preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency collection. The sea and sky were the same colour, grey and alive. The deck looked like a wet sidewalk, and we had 50 feet of visibility. But we knew those bombers were out there, and we weren't going to let them hit the transports. The Hellcats climbed into the storm, instruments flickering, radios crackling. Then, through a gap in the clouds, they saw them, 11 Japanese twin-engine bombers flying low, hugging the waves, their formation ragged but determined. The lead bomber was a Mitsubishi G4M Betty, its green paint streaked with salt, its red Hinomaru blurred by rain. Behind it flew aircraft of the 4th Air Group, veterans of Formosa and Mindoro, now desperate to strike back. Their orders were simple: find the convoy, die if necessary. They didn't expect fighters to meet them here, not from these small plodding ships they had once dismissed as floating warehouses. The Japanese air crews had studied American tactics. They knew where the fleet carriers were, hundreds of miles east, screened by destroyers. But they had misjudged the range and presence of the escort carriers. According to captured documents from the Japanese 4th Air Group War Diary, National Archives, RG-242, one pilot wrote, "At first we believed the Americans had brought another task force. Their fighters appeared suddenly from below the clouds, from a ship smaller than a cruiser. We could not understand it." From Geller's cockpit, the scene unfolded in slow motion. The Hellcats dove from 8,000 feet, their .50 caliber guns glowing orange in the dim light. The first Betty disintegrated under the barrage, its right wing snapping away like paper. Another tried to break off, climbing into the clouds, but the second pair of Hellcats cut across its path, their tracers stitching across the fuselage until it exploded in a flash of fuel. Below, the White Plains reported the attack by voice circuit. Multiple enemy aircraft splashed, CAP engaged, convoy unhurt. By the time the last Hellcat returned to the deck, 4 Japanese bombers burned on the sea's surface, and 3 more were unaccounted for. The storm still raged, but Ellison's men could feel it. They had faced death on terms their enemy no longer understood. In the post-war Allied translator and interpreter section, ATIS interrogations, Lieutenant Satoshi Takahashi, one of the few survivors of that day, described the horror of seeing Hellcats rise from escort decks. "We were briefed that the Americans had large carriers east of Luzon, but we were attacking transports near shore. The small ships there could not launch fighters. That was our understanding. Then, suddenly, fighters appeared in front of us. We thought they came from land bases. Only later did we learn they came from small carriers. It seemed impossible. The ship looked too small." Takahashi's words reveal a deep doctrinal shock. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its identity around massive fleet carriers like Akagi and Zuikaku, symbols of power and precision. The Americans, by contrast, had embraced industrial scale. Their strength was not elegance, but replication. The Japanese War Diary for February 21st recorded simply, "Enemy employs new method. Fighters rise from escort ships. Our tactics fail. Confidence eroding." It was more than a tactical note. It was an obituary for the old era of Japanese naval air warfare. The U.S. Victory Credits Board later confirmed the engagement, 7 Japanese aircraft destroyed. 2 probable. No U.S. losses. Each of those kills represented a Hellcat launched from a ship that, only 3 years earlier, most admirals had dismissed as unfit for combat. By February 1945, the U.S. Navy operated 122 escort carriers, a figure drawn from Lockheed production records and Naval History Center tallies. Of these, more than 70 carried Hellcats into active combat. Their contribution was disproportionate. Escort carrier squadrons flew over 40% of all naval air sorties in the Pacific from mid-1944 to war's end. This fact, more than any single battle, explains the shock reflected in Japanese testimonies. For every Hellcat shot down, 3 more took off from another deck somewhere else. The Japanese faced not a fleet, but a system, a web of carriers too numerous to target, too resilient to destroy. After the engagement, Ellison walked the flight deck in silence. The sea had calmed. The horizon glowed faintly red where the bombers had gone down. Around him, his crew worked in rhythm, refueling, rearming, wiping oil from canopies. He looked at the Hellcats, battered but alive, and thought of how far they'd come, from skepticism to salvation. Yet he also knew what it cost. His squadron's logbook shows exhaustion creeping into every line. Pilots showing signs of strain. Weather relentless. Maintenance at limit. Enemy less frequent but still determined. Victory in 1945 felt heavy. The Japanese were collapsing, yes, but so was every man's stamina. The jeep carriers had become both a miracle and a trap, too vital to rest, too vulnerable to stand down. On March 10th, White Plains joined a task group near Okinawa. There the lessons learned off Luzon would repeat, only deadlier. Kamikazes found them even in the storm belts. Yet again, Hellcats rose to meet them. One Japanese kamikaze pilot's testimony, recorded at the 1985 Pacific Theatre Veterans Reunion, captures the dread perfectly. We expected small ships to be defenseless. Instead, we saw their planes circling above like hawks. They seemed endless. We attacked knowing it was suicide, but the fear came not from dying. It came from the idea that these ships could never be stopped. That was the final transformation. What had begun as improvisation, tiny escort carriers with borrowed planes, had evolved into a psychological weapon. To the Japanese, the sea itself had turned hostile, alive with wings. Ellison's men survived the Luzon campaign, but the cost was plain on their faces. They had become the embodiment of America's wartime evolution. Ingenuity over grandeur, repetition over ritual. Historians later called it the democratization of the sky. The fleet carriers had been the aristocracy of air war. The escort carriers were the citizen soldiers, ordinary, mass-produced, and unstoppable. By mid-1945, Japanese pilots referred to them bitterly as chibi kokubokan, little carriers. The term carried both mockery and fear. And when the war ended, survivors from both sides would recall the same paradox, that the smallest ships had delivered the largest shock. At sunset, Ellison leaned against the rail, the salt wind cold against his skin. Below him, a Hellcat's wings gleamed with patches and burn marks. He thought of the Japanese pilots who had vanished into the grey, of the young men who had believed they were facing transports, not hunters. The Pacific stretched silent and infinite around him, a sea that had once been Japan's empire and was now, finally, America's domain. In the end, the lesson was simple but eternal. The measure of strength was not size, but surprise. And somewhere beneath the waves, the wreckage of 11 Japanese bombers told the story in silence, a story of men who had learned too late that even the smallest decks could hold the deadliest wings. By the spring of 1945, the Japanese pilots of the Imperial Navy's 343rd Kokutai, the last elite air group forged under Genda Minoru's desperate vision, faced a sky transformed. The enemy no longer appeared as a distant battle fleet accompanied by a predictable halo of carrier air patrols. Instead, the horizon shimmered with countless small silhouettes, stubby, square-decked ships that defied the traditional grammar of naval power. They were too small to be fleet carriers, yet their decks boiled with aircraft. To many Japanese airmen, they seemed to multiply overnight, swarming like insects across the South China Sea, the Philippines, and Okinawa. The reports called them pocket demons. In U.S. terminology, they were escort carriers, the Casablanca and Bogue classes now deployed in greater numbers than any other capital ship type in the Pacific. The Americans had built them in assembly line fashion, hulls converted from merchant vessels, each bearing 24 to 28 aircraft, crewed by 900 men and escorted by destroyers and destroyer escorts. To Tokyo's planners, such ships had been dismissed as auxiliaries, mere convoy escorts incapable of launching decisive strikes. Yet by 1945, these auxiliaries were everywhere. From debriefed pilots and captured signal logs, Allied translators reconstructed a portrait of disbelief. The sky was full of American fighters, though no great carriers were seen, one Japanese ensign from the 601st Air Group recounted in interrogation, as if they had appeared from merchant ships themselves. Another pilot described seeing Hellcats rising from the sea like spirits, their folded wings snapping open in the sunlight, vapour trailing as they climbed. The F-6F Hellcat, mass-produced by Grumman at a rate of 1 every 66 minutes, became the teeth of these small giants. With its 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R, 2800 engine, 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns and self-sealing tanks, it could absorb punishment that would disintegrate a Zero. In the hands of pilots trained under U.S. Navy doctrine emphasizing teamwork discipline and altitude advantage, the Hellcat made short work of Japanese fighters whose pilots were now rushed through training programs that once lasted years. The escort carrier's true innovation, however, lay not in firepower, but in dispersion. The U.S. Navy's pre-war faith in large, fast fleet carriers, the Enterprise, Yorktown, Hornet lineage, had been vindicated at Midway, but 1944–45 demanded ubiquity, not elegance. Amphibious invasions at Saipan, Peleliu, Leyte, Iwo Jima and Okinawa required air cover everywhere, all the time. The solution was industrial and logistical. Build dozens of small carriers faster than Japan could sink them, and fill the gaps between the great flat tops. The Casablanca class, 50 ships in total, emerged from Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver, Washington, between 1943 and 1944, a miracle of American shipbuilding speed. With a displacement of 10,000 tons and a top speed of 19 knots, they were slower than fleet carriers, but fast enough to accompany convoys and landing forces. Each carried a composite squadron of 12 fighters, usually Hellcats, and 12 torpedo or dive bombers, Avengers. But their true power came in numbers. Japanese reconnaissance pilots began reporting that the Americans have more decks than the ocean can hold. What they were witnessing was mass production as a weapon of war. Each small carrier extended the range of American air cover another 100 miles, forming overlapping zones of control that denied Japan's remaining pilots even the illusion of freedom. For Japanese aviators trained in the Bushido ideal of individual combat, the single duel, the perfect attack run, this mechanized swarm was incomprehensible. They had reduced air war to arithmetic, said Lieutenant Takashi Aoki in his 1946 interrogation at Atsugi. We fought with heart. They fought with industry. When the U.S. Navy began hunter-killer operations in the Philippine Sea and around Formosa, the escort carriers proved their unexpected lethality. Groups like Task Group 50.7, built around CVE's Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, and Kalinin Bay, prowled for Japanese submarines and surface raiders, often drawing attacks from desperate kamikazes. Yet even under suicide assault, the baby flat-tops endured. Their decks, simple and repairable, could be patched within hours. Their crews, drilled in damage control, turned potential catastrophes into survivable scars. The Battle off Samar in October 1944 became the escort carrier's baptism of legend. When Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's powerful center force of battleships and cruisers stumbled upon the lightly armed Taffy 3 unit, 6 escort carriers and their destroyer screen, the outcome should have been annihilation. Yet the tiny carriers, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, and Gambia Bay, launched every plane they had. Hellcats and Avengers swarmed Kurita's force, while destroyers like Johnston and Howell charged suicidally into the gunfire. The confusion was total. Japanese lookouts misidentified the CVES as fleet carriers and the destroyers as cruisers. Their commander hesitated. By the time he realized the truth, his formation was under air attack from merchant ships with wings. Captured Japanese logs described that encounter in tones of disbelief. Enemy small ships, aircraft type unknown, attacked with vigor beyond reason. Their planes seemed to come from phantom decks. From that day forward, no Japanese pilot or commander underestimated a small carrier again. By 1945, as the Empire reeled under continuous air raids, the psychological impact of these escort carriers surpassed their tactical role. To Japanese observers, they represented a new American doctrine: no distinction between the front and the rear, between logistics and defense. Every ship could now project power. Every convoy could launch death. In Okinawa, kamikaze reconnaissance teams radioed panicked reports of 100 flat tops. In truth, there were barely 50, but the illusion of omnipresence was the Allies' greatest weapon. A Japanese ensign flying from Kyushu in April 1945 noted in his diary, "Where there is sea, there are carriers. Where there is sky, there are Hellcats." That illusion, born of industrial abundance, modular shipbuilding, and relentless coordination, marked the final inversion of Pacific air power. Japan, which had begun the war with the most advanced carrier fleet on Earth, now found itself surrounded by mass-produced substitutes that outperformed the originals in aggregate. In a war that had begun with audacity, with 6 imperial carriers striking Pearl Harbor, it ended with humility, with merchant hulls launching fighters from plywood decks, with factory pilots flying machines named after wildcats. The Japanese pilots who faced them in those final months spoke afterward of the same haunting realization that had accompanied every late war encounter. America had learned to make airfields float. By the summer of 1945, those small decks stretched from Leyte to Okinawa, their Hellcats darkening the sky. To the Japanese who saw them from their cockpits, brief silhouettes against the sea before tracer fire cut their vision to black, the escort carriers were not ships at all. They were mirages, multiplying endlessly, reflections of a nation that had learned to wage total war through manufacture, coordination, and myth. And somewhere over the East China Sea, as a dying pilot glimpsed the last of them through blood-clouded eyes, he whispered what many would repeat in post-war testimony. "We thought they were the shadows of great carriers." We were wrong. They were the shadows of a great industry. By the last winter of the Pacific War, Japan's admirals no longer spoke of battles. They spoke of inevitability. Every dispatch, every intercepted signal, every dying transmission from a forward garrison ended the same way. American ships everywhere, aircraft unending. From Truk to Okinawa, the sea had become a mobile factory floor, and the product it produced was annihilation. The Japanese had built war on the premise of precision, of elite craftsmanship, master aviators, and flawless tactics born from the sword's edge. The Americans had built war on the premise of production, that quantity, when directed by discipline, would acquire a moral weight of its own. In the escort carrier, that philosophy became steel. To an American engineer at Kaiser's Vancouver shipyards in 1943, the Casablanca-class CVE was just another project, a modular structure built from merchant hulls, shaped on slipways where Liberty ships had stood weeks before. To a Japanese intelligence officer in 1945, examining photographs of the same ships captured from Allied press releases, it was something uncanny. A machine that birthed machines. Each Casablanca-class escort carrier was assembled in less than 90 days. Some were finished in as little as 52. They were designed to be replaceable, not permanent monuments like the Akagi or Kaga, but expendable instruments. Each ship carried only 28 aircraft, but with over 50 in commission, the total strength surpassed the combined fleet air wings of the Imperial Navy at its 1941 zenith. The Japanese pilots who survived encounters with these baby flat-tops could not grasp the logic. They searched for a hierarchy, for flagship carriers, for concentrated power, and found none. Instead, they faced a system that had dissolved hierarchy into distribution. Each small carrier functioned as a node in a vast, adaptive network of production and destruction. From U.S. Navy logistics records preserved in the National Archives, the numbers reveal the quiet miracle. Between January 1944 and June 1945, the U.S. commissioned an average of one escort carrier every 10 days. Each one required 5,000 tons of steel, 3,000 miles of wiring, and 10,000 rivets an hour during peak assembly. At the Grumman plant in Bethpage, New York, the Hellcat itself had become an artifact of assembly line transcendence. Parts from 4,423 subcontractors, shipped by rail to Long Island, test-flown, crated, and dispatched to the West Coast for loading. Japan's naval architects had once said that ships had souls. The Americans, by 1945, built ships that had purposes. The distinction was theological. In the air technical intelligence interrogations conducted after the war, several captured officers from the 4th Air Group described their first realization that the escort carriers were not anomalies, but an ecosystem. "At first," said Lieutenant Commander Naoshi Kano, "we thought each was a converted merchantman sent to a local operation, but they appeared again and again, off Palau, off the Philippines, off Okinawa, faster than we could record them. We realized they were growing the way coral grows. It was an apt metaphor. The coral reef is not one structure but a living accumulation, countless organisms forming a single mass. The escort carrier fleet was the same, a distributed reef of steel expanding by industrial biology. Each unit protected the next. Each one multiplied the reach of the others. The Japanese aircraft that struck at Leyte in October 1944 expected open ocean and scattered targets. What they found instead were layered zones of defense, radar pickets, Hellcat patrols, and anti-aircraft curtains that seemed impossible to penetrate. A Japanese pilot from the 201st Air Group, shot down during those attacks, recalled later, "We thought we had broken through the screen, but there was another carrier behind it, always another." To the Americans aboard the CVES, the illusion of invincibility was sustained by discipline. Pilots flew 12-hour rotations. Maintenance crews slept beside spare engines, tools in hand. Deck crews became specialists in choreography, recover, refuel, rearm, relaunch in under 8 minutes. When a ship was damaged, others took its place. When a squadron lost aircraft, replacements arrived within days. It was this replaceability that unnerved Japanese observers most. In their diaries and post-war memoirs, there is a tone of despair, not of defeat in battle, but of confrontation with something beyond battle. "We could not understand how a nation could fight this way," one officer from the 701st Air Group wrote. "Even if we sank 10 of their ships, 20 more appeared. They had turned the ocean itself into a conveyor belt." Back in the United States, the home front had adapted to the same rhythm. Film reels showed Kaiser's Miracle Yard and its female welders sending new hulls to sea. The term victory ships became shorthand for both morale and machinery. The Casablanca-class carriers were among the first ships in history whose production could be tracked by calendar, not campaign. To workers, each finished hull meant one more fortress afloat. This was industrial warfare elevated to faith. It was democracy mechanized, each worker's rivet another act of defiance. When President Roosevelt had called America the arsenal of democracy, he could not have foreseen how literal the phrase would become. In the Pacific, those arsenals were now mobile. Japanese post-war analyses of the campaign around the Philippines reveal how completely this industrial theology had inverted traditional military logic. Where the Imperial Navy sought decisive battle, the US Navy sought continuous availability. The Japanese concept of kantai kessen, one fleet action to decide the war, could not survive against a system that rendered decision itself meaningless. At the 1962 US-Japanese Aviation History Symposium, surviving officers like Genda Minoru and Okumiya Masatake debated how Japan had misunderstood the American threat. Genda admitted, "We imagined American carriers as few and precious. We did not understand that to them each ship was only a part, that the loss of one was a fraction, not a wound. To him, the escort carriers were the symbol of this alien logic, ships that should not have been dangerous but were, precisely because their strength came from ordinariness. They did not inspire awe, they inspired inevitability." In 1985, at a veterans' reunion in Honolulu, an American sailor from USS Suwannee, a Bogue-class escort carrier that fought from North Africa to Leyte Gulf, summarized it more simply. "We were just a piece of a machine, but the machine never stopped." His Japanese counterpart, Captain Tadashi Nakajima, who had flown over Leyte and survived being shot down by a Hellcat, stood and replied softly, "That is what broke us, not your courage, but your endlessness." In that moment, the story of the escort carriers transcended the war itself. They had begun as compromises, slow, small, and expendable. Yet by 1945, they embodied the full transformation of warfare, when every ship becomes a weapon and every worker becomes a strategist. The Japanese had begun the Pacific War believing that spirit could overcome material. The Americans ended it, proving that material, when animated by spirit, could become something divine. The escort carriers were not majestic, they were not immortal, but they were enough. And in the wreckage-strewn seas of 1945, as the last Japanese pilots fell into the smoke and foam, they understood, too late, that these small ships had become what Japan's great fleet once aspired to be: factories that floated, industries that flew, and empires that built themselves anew each dawn. By August 1945, the skies that had once carried the rising sun were silent. The Imperial Navy, whose carrier fleets had once ranged across the Pacific like gods, no longer existed. The few surviving pilots who stumbled home from the ruins of Okinawa and Formosa spoke in the past tense, not of defeat in combat, but of a nation outbuilt, outlasted, and outthought. For those men, the sight that haunted them was not the mushroom cloud or the roar of the B-29s. It was the humble escort carrier, those slow, square-decked ships that had filled the ocean like a rumour. They had no grandeur, no mystique, and no poetry. Yet they had erased an empire. In interrogation rooms at Atsugi and Yokosuka, Allied translators recorded the same astonishment in testimony after testimony. "We believed America was soft," said one lieutenant from the 343rd Kokutai. "But you built ships faster than we could think. We were taught to die for the emperor. You were taught to assemble." Japan had begun the war with the best carrier pilots in the world, men honed by years of peacetime training, executing precision in the air like calligraphy. But the logic of industrial war rendered mastery irrelevant. The Americans had replaced art with process and spirit with system. Each Hellcat, stamped from factory moulds, replaced the romantic fragility of the Zero with mechanical inevitability. When historians later studied the battle off Samar, they called it the last samurai charge of the sea. But to the men who fought it, it was something colder, the moment when courage met computation, and computation won. By the time Emperor Hirohito spoke to his people on August 15th, his voice carried across a nation of ruins and ghosts. "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage," he began, the understatement of a millennium. Yet beneath that resignation lay something deeper, recognition that Japan had lost not to numbers, but to a civilization that had made numbers into faith. In post-war Tokyo, US occupation officers toured the shattered remnants of the Yokosuka naval arsenal. Among the documents recovered were hand-drawn sketches of American escort carriers, annotated in disbelief. Why so many? Why so small? Why so effective? One officer, decades later, would write in his memoir, "We had imagined the Americans would build monuments. Instead, they built multiplication." In the Pacific's long aftermath, the escort carrier faded from memory, replaced by jets, missiles, and nuclear deterrence. Yet its legacy endured, quiet and absolute. It proved that industry could think, that logistics could dream, and that mass could become morality when guided by purpose. For the Japanese pilots who saw Hellcats rise from those tiny ships, the lesson came too late. They had fought for an empire of craftsmanship and died before an empire of factories. And when the war ended, the ocean itself seemed to whisper their epitaph. The great ships sank with honour. The small ships won with work.